I want to say good morning, but I now realize that it's good afternoon, everybody. For me, it's morning. I just stepped off the plane, so I'm a little bit tired. But I'm very, very excited to be here. I'm going to just say one thing before I dive in. I feel so passionate about this subject that often I will start to speak very, very quickly. And I understand that maybe not everybody in the room is going to enjoy it if I start speaking too quickly. So if at any moment I start to speak too quickly, I want you to shoot your hand up, and that will remind me that I have gotten too excited and I now need to slow down. So that's a little contract I want to make between you and me, that you will be honest enough to tell me, David, you're speaking too quickly, and then I will slow down. There's two other things I just want to kind of open up with saying. And the first is, I always open my presentation with this quote. It's an old Chinese proverb which says, basically, it's really hard to predict the future. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think is going on, what some of the changes that I see taking place in government, around open data, around open government, based on some of the things that I've been seeing. And there's kind of this other quote that leads me to that place. This is one of my other favorite quotes to put up, which is, the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed, which is a quote from a science fiction writer. And I think I've been very lucky in that I get to work with some organizations like OpenMRS or Mozilla that I think live a little bit in the future already. And when I see how they work, I'm able to distill out how I think that might change government, how that might change citizens' engagement with government, and how it might change how we work with one another. So I'm going to try to do two things in my presentation today. The first is I want to talk about why this is all taking place, like what's actually going on, just so that people have some language and some frameworks to explaining to their colleagues why this stuff matters, and why do we care about the fact that citizens are starting to do things on their own. And then the second thing I want to do is I want to talk about some of the examples that I think that are going out there that are particularly interesting. So what are people doing that we should be keeping our eye on because it might be influencing some of the choices you want to make or some of the choices your government officials want to make. So first, there's some new economics of organizing. For those who haven't read it, there's a fantastic book called Here Comes Everybody by one of my favorite authors, Clay Shirky. And he resurrects a very famous question that was posed in economics in the 1930s. And the very simple question was, if the marketplace is so efficient, why do we have companies? Why do we even have companies? I mean, if the marketplace is so efficient, shouldn't we just all kind of get together and let's build a locomotive? So I'll design it, and maybe you'll get the materials, and you'll build it, and then you'll sell it, and it'll all just happen. And then if we want to do it again, we'll just do it again. If it was really frictionless and if so efficient, that's what would happen. But that's not what happens. Instead, we have companies. In fact, we have companies that seem to be getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And so this important question about, well, why do we have companies, led this researcher, this guy called Richard Coast, to kind of explore what's driving this. And what he discovered was, when people work together, there's a transaction cost. There's a penalty we pay to working with one another. So for example, if we're all working together and one of you calls in sick, well, someone's got to figure out who's going to take that person's place for the day. Or if someone has a baby and they're going to be away for a year, who's going to fill that role? Or who's going to pay for the office space? Or who's going to rent the phones? And so ultimately, the terrible news was, we need managers. We need people who can oversee us and help guide kind of what we're doing. And the worst news about managers is that they cost money. So we actually have to not only make enough money to pay our salary, we have to make enough money to pay our salary and pay for the managers who oversee us. And what kind of he discovered was, okay, so we have these managers, and as the tools that we have for communicating and working together get better, so as the transaction costs get lower, those managers can oversee more and more people. So back in the 18th century, a manager would oversee an office of 2 or 3, maybe 4 people. Whereas today, managers sometimes oversee 20, 30, 100, 200 people. So what you have is, kind of try to graph it here a little bit, is you have this ceiling around how big companies get as transaction costs get lower and lower and lower. And the companies get bigger and bigger and bigger. And what you've seen over the last 100 years is enormous companies begin to arise. So what was a huge company in the 1930s was maybe 50,000, 20,000 people was a huge company. That's like a medium-sized company now. I mean, big company, like Walmart's got 1 million employees worldwide. So the size of companies has gotten a lot bigger. And you can kind of see what's happened is, if you are under that curve, which means that you're doing work profitably, you're at a size where you can still make money, you are in the private sector, but there's some things that are so important, like healthcare in many countries, my country and your country, that are so important, we decide actually we want someone not in the private sector to deal with that. And so it happens above this Gaussian curve. Clay Shirky then goes on and says, well, here's a question I have to ask, which is, what happens if the transaction costs actually do drop to zero? What if we are working in an almost frictionless environment? What happens to these organizations? What happens to how we work together? And this is exactly the huge challenge that government and the private sector is facing right now, is that you have government that doesn't have to be profitable, so it can be inefficient, it can have more managers than maybe it can afford. You have the private sector which can't. And then you have this new entity that's beginning to arise. And so you look at a company like Flickr, and the way that they're able to get all of these photos from all of these people and pull them to one place. And how many employees does Flickr have? They're like 20, 30 employees running their servers. And if you tried to do that just 20 years ago, try to gather photos from everybody all over the world and then try to get them to redistribute to people, it would have taken you thousands and thousands of people. So in the space of 20 years, a task that would have taken hundreds of thousands, if not tens of thousands of people, is now being done by 20 people. That's an enormous collapse. So some people said, I don't think that matters to government. It's not going to impact us. And I go, that's interesting. So I wanted to think of an example that I thought would resonate, would explain this in a less theoretical way and in a way that you could sink your teeth into. And so I was kind of thinking about what was crazy and different. And I thought nothing is more crazy than spaceflight. That is, this is maybe the most difficult activity that you could imagine engaging in. So does anybody know who this guy is? Anybody that look familiar? Yeah, so it's Yuri Gagarin. Someone screened it out. So this is Yuri Gagarin. This is Yuri Gagarin. He's the first human to get into space. The Russians put Yuri Gagarin in space in 1961. Sometimes people, especially when I do this presentation in the United States, are more familiar with this guy, who went up not long afterwards because he was American. But here we have two guys who went into space because enormous government bureaucracies decided that it was a strategic imperative that they put someone into space. There was no way the private sector could have put these guys in space. There was no money in it. And the costs were astronomical. That's a terrible pun, I'm sorry. So if you look at this, this is like what, maybe 50 years ago. Okay, so let's fast forward to 2004. This is Mike Melville and his Spaceship One, which won the Ansari X Prize. So the Ansari X Prize was a $10 million prize for an entirely privately funded company that was able to put a spaceship with a human on it into space, get it back, and put it back into space again within 2 weeks. So in 2004, spaceflight, the thing that 60 years ago nobody could have imagined doing in the private sector, now being done by the private sector. And in fact, Richard Branson of Virgin has bought the rights to Spaceship One. And I think starting later this year or next year, out of Austin, Texas, or somewhere nearby, is going to be doing space tourism using his spaceship. So our story would be interesting enough if that's where it ended. But I want you to take a look at this project, which I discovered not so long ago, called Direct Launcher. So it turns out that the Americans are retiring the space shuttle. There's going to be no more space shuttle. And they have to replace it. And there's, all sorts of work going on within NASA to figure out, okay, let's design a new spaceship. And a bunch of the engineers who work for NASA were looking at the plans, and they started saying to themselves, you know what, this is not the cheapest way of doing this. This is not the safest way of doing this. And it's not the most efficient way of doing it. And so in secret, they started to organize and create an alternative plan for a rocket outside of their work. And some other people caught wind of this, and they started to help too. People who didn't work for NASA. And over a course of a couple of months, they published everything that they did. They put out their plans, and they said, we have a better plan than the official NASA plan. And if you think that doesn't matter, here's the most interesting part, that when Obama was elected president, this alternative plan had so much buzz around it that organizers of the plan were invited to the White House to present their alternative plan to the White House, and the White House was so impressed that it struck a special committee that's actually formally comparing the official NASA plan to this self-organized plan created by NASA engineers and a community of people around the world who want to help them out. So what you have here is a community of people self-organizing to put someone into space. So on this chart, we've moved in the space of 60 years of space travel being something that was purely government, to something that 10 years ago was maybe something the private sector do, to today, already this new type of organizing is beginning to get engaged in it. And there's other powerful examples. So people, I think, know about this company and how it controlled access to the internet through its web browser, and how this group came along and they found a new way of organizing to create software called open source. And they started to think about, okay, well, we don't have the resources of Microsoft, so we're going to create a browser for a whole lot cheaper. So they have a lead developer who's actually a friend of mine. He lives in Toronto, and he has a staff of about 120 people. And they have hundreds of people around the world who on a daily basis contribute software code to the Firefox web browser. On a weekly or monthly basis, they have thousands of more people who just contribute code. They have 500,000 beta testers who test the software, and 300 million users worldwide today. Firefox has been the fastest web browser in the world, created largely by volunteers with a tiny, tiny number of people who are actually paid. And sometimes you don't even know what that community is going to do. What you're looking at here is that when Firefox 1 was released, people were really excited, but they had no money. But they wanted to tell the world. And so one person on their own stood up and said, I'm putting $20 forward, and if anybody else wants to give me money, give me whatever money you want, and I'm just going to buy the biggest ad that I can in the New York Times. And what you're looking at is a $200,000 ad paid for by all of the people whose names are kind of etched into the ad that I believe bought a 2-page spread in the New York Times. Completely self-organized. And this is the power of people coming together and being able to work in a friction-free environment. But what's most interesting about Mozilla is that they are, in practice, a consumer and citizen-led response to a regulatory crisis. I mean, you Europeans understood the challenge of having Microsoft have a monopoly over access to the web, and you actually launched an antitrust case. So do you know when your antitrust case finally got resolved and the full impact of it, like its implementation, was finally completed? About a year ago. Like, that case was launched 10 years ago. Like, the entire challenge of the open web was gone a year ago. This whole thing was done. The governments couldn't move fast enough to solve this problem, so citizens got together and did it on their own. This is like citizens getting together and doing trust busting or monopoly busting in the 1930s. And I think we can do this in lots of other spaces, and what I think we're really seeing is citizens coming together and tapping out and tapping into what I call the long tail, and really the long tail of public policy.